Welcome everyone. My name is Naeem Askar and I'm a partner solution architect specializing on SAP. And in this session, we're going to be talking about securing your SAP environments on AWS. With that in mind, I have one of our SMEs in the house. Vamsi, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, thanks, Naeem. My name is Vamsi Yanamadala. I'm also a partner solution architect specializing in SAP. And today, as Naeem mentioned, we're going to talk about securing your SAP environment on AWS. And we'll cover kind of four main topics. The first is all around kind of multi-account strategy and how to lay out your AWS accounts. Then we'll cover VPC defense. So we'll be talking about things like network ACLs, security groups, subnets.
Yeah.
Then we'll cover inbound, outbound communication. So that could be to interfaces and third parties, as well as to for end users to log in and get access to the SAP system. And then finally, we'll talk about how to securely take backups using backend to an S3 bucket. So to start off with, Naeem, one of the first things is really around designing your multi-account strategy, right? How you're going to split up your SAP environment as well as all the supporting systems. And one of those first things I know we have discussions with customers and partners is that shared services VPC, right? So do you want to talk about kind of what are some of those elements that sit in the shared account?
Yeah, thanks, Vamsi. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop a region and you can see it's come out in blue. And then within that, we're going to start dropping in workloads within their own AWS accounts and their own VPC. So the first one that we're going to look at is the shared one, as Vamsi mentioned. So we're just going to tag this as shared. So I'm just going to draw it in right in here. So this is our shared account. So things like auditing, logging, and so on will go here. And remember, this is spanning across multiple availability zones within a single VPC and an AWS account.
Correct. Yeah. And there's also some probably SAP specific things that we always talk with customers. Things like Solution Manager can oftentimes sit in that shared services VPC. Even things like EFS, so having a centralized place for all of your file shares, and you can that way manage the connectivity to all of the SAP systems in a central place. So definitely those antivirus, we'll touch on quite a few others, but I think that's some of the things in that shared services VPC. And then, what's next, I guess, what do we work with customers on?
So what we can do is we can actually start deploying additional workloads, and we'll start to build this architecture out for you guys to understand, some of the security best practices as we go along. So if I drop in a second AWS account, again with a single VPC across multi-AZ, now this is our production account. So I'm just going to drop in prod right here. So we'll call this prod. So this is for our production workloads, so business critical workloads, and we'll actually come back to this in a minute. Where Vamsi will kind of explain some of the key security aspects from a production perspective. But let me also drop in a third account. And this is for things like non-production. So it could be QA, it could be dev. And again, you probably have multiple accounts for this, not just a single account. So we'll call this one non-prod. Now, when we talk about deploying across multiple accounts, each deployment within their own VPC. One of the key benefits of this is network isolation. So Vamsi, you want to run through some of the key aspects of network isolation for us?
Okay, sure. So let's start with when we look at network isolation, the way to look at it is really layers of defense, right? So when we look at first how we set up that VPC, we'll always carve out specific subnet, or in this case, we have one public subnet in green, and then where Naeem is drawing the EC2 instance, we have a private subnet. In many cases with SAP, there may be multiple private subnets where we deploy SAP. So for this case, we'll have the subnetting, which will help provide a piece of the network isolation. And then we'll also have network ACLs, which is at the subnet level and allows us to control that access from subnet to subnet. So do route tables. Route tables will help us route from even other VPCs or other subnets within an existing VPC and how that traffic is routed.
Brilliant.
And then finally, we have our EC2 instance, and at the instance level, we have what's called a security group, which allows kind of an instance level firewall where we can control the ports and the access to that EC2 instance. And then, all of this is through monitoring, right, Naeem? So, I mean, it's all good that we set this up, but we need to be able to monitor this. And VPC flow logs is going to provide that ability to see that inbound, outbound traffic between, let's say, our shared services VPC to our prod.
Brilliant. So just to summarize, Vamsi, we're saying that because we're deploying our production workloads in their own VPC, we can actually control that traffic that's coming in and out of that VPC with network access control lists, with security groups around our instances, with VPC flow logs and monitoring, and you can utilize services such as Guard Duty to actually help you monitor those VPC flow logs and do a level of threat detection. But Vamsi, what about when we want to actually have user control or user access? How do we control user access to production? Maybe we don't want the developers having access to production. How do we go about managing that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. The short answer or first answer is really all around how you set up your IAM or identity access management, and that's really at the account level. So in this example with developers, we may only want to give read-only privilege in production, so they can see the configuration, see the settings, but they don't have permission to change any of that. But in non-prod, or let's say there's even a separate sandbox account that we have only for sandbox users, we may want our developers being able to start up a new EC2 instance with a new S4 system. That maybe they want to adjust the security groups and allow specific permissions so that they can test some new interfaces. We can give that extended access and really control it at the IAM level, where in each account they have specific privileges.
So by having the VPC and our production workloads deployed in the VPC, but then deployed within their own AWS accounts, that actually brings identity access management into play to have that user level of control, right? But what about when we're talking about things like data isolation? How do we go about achieving that in this kind of architecture?
Yeah, so that's another, I would say, key area that we always talk with customers around. So when we talk data isolation, I think there's a couple of different angles at this. First, when we want to talk about specifically the HANA data and HANA log files, those are going to be EBS volumes or block storage.
Yeah.
And we're always going to recommend using EBS encryption by default to secure those and have those encrypted at rest, as well as when we talk about taking AMIs or Amazon machine images or snapshots, we would also recommend having that encryption standard in place and making sure that from a multi-account you have to explicitly share that. So in the case, let's say you have a DR account which I know we can't fit in here, but if we have a DR account that's separate, we would have to explicitly share all of those AMIs and to allow for the recovery, so we can control that access, of the sharing of AMIs. And then when we talk about taking backups of the HANA database, there's security there as well, right, Naeem?
Yeah. So as we always recommend that for backups, for example, you'd be using the AWS Backend Agent or AWS Backups now, and you would be storing those backups in an S3 bucket. So if we quickly start to sketch this in, I'm just drawing my S3 bucket right here. And then the question comes in, Vamsi, is how do I actually get my backups from my HANA instance to the S3 bucket for storage?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about doing it securely, you're going to use what's called a gateway endpoint to basically allow the VPC secure access to that S3 bucket. And with that, we're able to use the backend agent and not need to traverse the public internet or go anywhere outside of the VPC directly to your S3 bucket.
Right.
And in addition to that, there's also permissions around which instances at the instance level that we would set up through IAM to allow the permission to take those backups.
Okay, so you have to have IAM permissions to allow the EC2 instance role to actually save and retrieve the backups from the S3 bucket. So let's just drop an IAM instance role in right here. The other thing to point out here is around backup encryption. So by saving our backups to S3, S3 has a number of encryption options available for you. So you have server-side encryption with S3, so that's fully managed by S3 automatically. You have, let me see if I can squeeze it in somewhere. So we've got SSE S3, we've got server-side encryption KMS, which means that your key is managed by the key management service, and you can actually set it up with rotation and do a lot of configuration on that key. Then you even have things like a server-side encryption C, which is basically the encryption key is fully managed by the customer, but the encryption is still taking place on the server side. And there are actually a number of options in addition to that where, for example, the customer fully manages the key on the customer side and the encryption and decryption of that key.
Yeah. So really, for a lot of customers, all those options are available, and it really depends on the governance and requirements for their SAP environment on what is the right solution. But there is a solution available. Okay, great. So Naeem, I know we've kind of covered off quite a bit of ground here. We've talked about multi-account strategy, laying out a shared services, a prod and a non-prod accounts, and then we've talked about how to secure those, both from a networking isolation, a user isolation, as well as a data isolation. And we even covered off, how to securely take backups. But the one piece is kind of this interconnectivity, right? So there are scenarios where this shared services is going to need to reach both the prod and the non-prod accounts, and vice versa. There may be scenarios from a code compare standpoint where non-prod will need to connect to see the current production existing code. So how do we handle those interconnectivity between these three accounts?
Thanks, Vamsi. That's a good question. So there's two ways you can approach this on AWS. The first is VPC pairing. So VPC pairing, for example, if we take shared and prod, we could set up a VPC pairing connection between shared and prod. And then we could set up another VPC connection between non-prod and prod. So we have a connection going across like that. But the problem here is that non-prod cannot access or reach shared because VPC pairing is not transitive. So that would mean we would have to have an explicit connection between non-prod and shared and any other AWS accounts that you've got deployed. So managing VPC pairing in a multi-account strategy gets quite complicated. And this is where Transit Gateway comes into play. So let me just drop a Transit Gateway right here, like this. So this is our Transit Gateway, and I've dropped it into the shared account. And then what we can actually do is we can actually attach a connection to each of the VPCs to this central focal point, and you can actually manage that from a single route table as well. So from an operational perspective, things become a little bit more simpler. So let's actually draw a connection from our shared Transit Gateway all the way across to our production VPC, and then we'll do another connection. So this is a second attachment to our Transit Gateway, and that will go to our non-prod environment. And now what's happening is that each of the AWS accounts and the VPCs can actually communicate with each other through that central hub focal point with a single route table managing it. So operationally, things become a lot more simpler than just VPC peering.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and I think you hit the main point of why we recommend Transit Gateway is the administration, right? I mean, this is a very simple layout where we have only 3 VPCs and accounts, but when we start talking, non-prod could be, multiple landscapes. You could have N+1 landscapes. And if you need to control that access, it becomes very cumbersome through VPC peering. But with Transit Gateway, you have a single route table to kind of just maintain versus having to maintain in multiple different accounts all of those VPC peering definitions. So great, we got that all plumbed up. Now our prod can talk to shared services, but what about end users? So we're going to have in this scenario, let's say a corporate data center with thousands of users trying to hit this SAP system. How do we bring that in so that they can hit the prod production SAP systems?
Okay, so let's assume that let's actually draw in a data center. So this is outside of the AWS network and outside of the AWS region. So I'm going to draw a little data center here, nice little office building. Hopefully they've got a nicer building than this. And then what you'll see is, so this is outside. Remember, the region is in blue. And then from there, we can actually we have two methods two services that you can utilize to connect your on-prem data center and your users that are on-prem to AWS. So the first I'm going to just highlight here is Direct Connect. And this is a dedicated DX, we'll abbreviate as DX. This is a dedicated line from your on-prem data center to your AWS. In this case, we're connecting it to our Transit Gateway, which is another attachment. And you can actually provision this using AWS service providers and so on. And then the second option here, Vamsi, is that you can actually use site-to-site VPN. So let's just drop that in. So we've got our VPN. And in this case, when we talk about securing these connections, so we're talking about data in transit, you would have IPsec encryption for your DX connection, and then VPNs would also have IPsec encryption as part of that VPN connection.
Yeah, and one thing to point out here is that with this site-to-site VPN, you are traversing the public internet, so that IPsec is a very key feature. With Direct Connect, you can actually overlay a VPN to provide that encryption in transit, but it is a dedicated line that you would set up with the telco provider to a primary access point on AWS. So it is a little bit different, but I think what we see in the real world practice is there's oftentimes multiple solutions. So maybe there is a Direct Connect and a VPN, both deployed to allow access, and one is a backup to the other. So great, we've got end user connectivity, we've got interconnectivity. What about, let's talk about external parties. So, one, for sure that every SAP customer needs to plan for is providing SAP and use access to, potentially get onto the system if there's an issue, or open up a support message and those types of activities. What are, how do we solve for that?
So good question. So let's assume that we have SAP outside, as you would expect. They're outside of the AWS network. So we have SAP in the cloud right there. And then on the AWS side, you would have your SAP router deployed in a public subnet. So for example, if I drop a SAP router in right here, so this is an EC2 instance running in a public subnet, and we'll talk about how you secure this in a minute. So you have the SAP router like this, and it's in a public subnet, so we have to secure this. And the way we would go about doing this is we'll actually wrap it in a security group, which only allows access to SAP support in this case. So we would then have a line of communication between SAP and the SAP router, which would then in turn give you access to your production workloads, for example. And the other thing just to point out here is this connection would be secured with SNC.
Correct. Great. So, I mean, obviously there's going to be any number of potentially third-party interfaces, and multiple different patterns, but I think the SAP support one kind of shows, how you can achieve this. And, I would say, we've covered off really all of the core things, but one of the common questions we also get asked, even in previous sessions, right, Naeem, is, connectivity to the web dispatcher, and how do we secure that web dispatcher traffic
Okay.
hitting that SAP system?
So for a web dispatcher, let's actually just map out a smaller architecture just here in this little box. So what we'll do is we'll drop an app server in first. So this is our app server, and then this will be fronted with a web dispatcher. Call this app server, and then on top of that we have our web dispatcher, which sits just here. And again, if you notice, we're actually dropping this in a private subnet, so we just call it WD. And then what we would do is we would front this with an application load balancer that would be sitting, let's assume, just about here. And the reason we do that is because if we have an application load balancer fronting the web dispatcher, it actually starts to give you access to AWS native security services like the web application firewall, like AWS Shield, for example. So we would have our network application load balancer redirecting traffic. Actually, let's just do it like this: redirecting traffic to our web dispatcher and then onwards to our app server.
All right. So that's great. So let's maybe summarize kind of everything we've covered here today in this video. So first, we talked about multi-account strategies, and kind of the things you need to start thinking about in order to build a multi-account strategy, things like shared services. We also touched on network security and how to secure your VPC, right? So we covered network ACL, security groups, subnetting, route tables, and kind of at a high level, how to start defining those to meet your customer's need. And then we covered user isolation, data isolation. We talked about inbound, outbound connectivity. So we've covered off Transit Gateway, which is key.
Yeah.
And then, we did touch on backups and how to securely take backups. So with that, Naeem, I think we've, kind of run out of time.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thanks, Vamsi. Great session. Appreciate you taking the time to join us. Everyone, make sure you watch the rest of our lightboarding videos that are published as well here. We've got one on high availability. We've got one on disaster recovery. We have DMO in a single step to AWS. So please make sure you run through those and have a watch of those as well. With that said, any final words, Vamsi?
No, thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video.
See you then.